Hello, everyone. Welcome to Behind the Headlines. I'm Lee Camp. Thanks for joining us. I have another amazing guest for you. Please take a moment, by the way, to hit like and subscribe and thumbs up and share and all of those good things, and leave a comment in the comment section. Even if you got nothing to say, it helps us fight the algorithms. So, another great guest and a very important guest at this time when we are seeing so many stories about how exactly policing in America works, what's going wrong on a regular basis. And so I'm excited to talk to him. This is the second or third time I've spoken to Alex Vitale, and he's the author of The End of Policing, which is one of my favorite books on police. He's a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and CUNY GC, and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project. So please welcome Professor Alex Vitale. Hello.
Hi, Lee. Yeah, CUNY GC is the CUNY Graduate Center where CUNY has all its PhD programs.
I was realizing I had jotted that down, and I was like, oh shit, I don't
What
actually
does
know.
that actually stand for? Yeah.
I don't actually know where GC is. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time.
You bet.
This is always an important topic. I guess we can start with the even though a lot of it is stuff that can be talked about anytime. We can start with what's currently in the news, which is the murder of Tyree Nichols and the fight against Cop City, which also included a murder of a forest offender, what many are calling an assassination. And yeah, I wonder if you could just speak on those two and maybe what they say about our policing in a larger way, because people do like to point to these moments. And even if they're being critical, they like to say, well, those cops shouldn't have acted that way in that moment.
Well, if only the cops in Memphis had had training in Cop City and Atlanta, I think this whole thing would have been prevented.
Totally, definitely. Yeah.
There's
which they did. It didn't. Did some of them or something come from Atlanta? Actually, I think they.
The chief. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The chief had come from Atlanta. Yeah. So there is actually an organic connection there. And but I think really this has to be understood as a political issue, at least as much as it's a policing issue. Mm-hmm. And the likelihood of something like this happening in Memphis had been brewing for a long time. So I've been working with activists on the ground in Memphis for several years. During the Trump administration, going into the election, Trump launched this electoral strategy called Operation Relentless Pursuit that targeted 6 American cities controlled by Democrats and said, look, the problems of Memphis and Baltimore and Kansas City is not disinvestment, deindustrialization, austerity. No, the problem is gangbangers and cartels. And Trump has the solution, which is send in the feds, give the local police a lot of money, and turn everything, all the problems of those cities into problems of crime to be managed by policing.
Right.
And what the leadership of Memphis did is that they were like, great, we're just going to embrace this whole thing completely uncritically. The fact that it was Trump's reelection campaign strategy, right, to reframe these problems in ways that fit with Republican talking points was completely lost on the Democratic leadership of Memphis. Mm-hmm. And they just took all this money and beefed up policing. And then when the uptick in some kinds of crime happened around COVID, instead of investing more in public health, in supports for people who are unemployed or have experienced all kinds of trauma, they said, we're going to create a scorpion unit. Which we know what scorpions do. They go and they kill things by stinging them, right? And this is their vision about how do we solve problems in Memphis? Well, we get more people with more guns and more power and less oversight and less accountability, and we set them loose in the poorest, most non-white parts of the city to get the bad guys. And these guys had all the police reform training. They'd had the
Wow.
implicit bias training and the de-escalation training and all, we're wearing body cameras for the most part. We're operating under a bystander policy. All these things that we were told for years were going to fix policing. They'd already done all that. And the reason it didn't work is because they were doing exactly what the mayor and city leaders told them to do, which is to go out and break heads, to do whatever it takes. Right. And the idea that you're going to fix that with a couple of hours of de-escalation training, which they had already had, is just ludicrous.
And I actually highlighted on a live stream a couple of weeks ago that the mainstream media was going, look, the body cams work. Now we have evidence of what happened to Tyree Nichols. And it's like, okay, you have this rare moment when, yes, we now have video of what happened, but it rarely comes out. I mean, there's thousands of police killings a year. We rarely see these videos. It's after the fact, so it didn't save his life. And there's God knows how many times that police cover up the camera, turn it off, say it was malfunctioning, etc.
So I wrote a piece for MSNBC about this recently. And for one thing, the most revealing footage is not from body cameras. It's from a stationary surveillance camera, not from the officer's perspective. Mm-hmm. So, but the other thing is that, you could tell that the officers were performing for their body cameras. They were saying things that didn't comport with what was actually happening. Like, get on the ground. He's already on the ground. Stop resisting. He's not resisting. Put your hands behind your back. Well, they have his hands in their arm. He can't do anything with his hands because they're controlling. So they're manipulating this body camera footage. Does this mean body cameras are like totally pointless and should be abandoned? It's complicated. Some defense attorneys say that they've gotten their clients off of criminal charges because of these cameras, and we have to take that seriously. And we do learn something about what's going on. But my conclusion in the MSNBC piece was that this is not going to fix policing. This is not going to save us from the violence of policing, that the problems are much bigger than the presence of these cameras.
And yeah, to me, it's an example of something that is positive in a sense. Like, yes, I'd rather have some video of cops behaving badly than not. But, it's kind of similar to like a bill saying that cops are only allowed to kill 1,000 people a year instead of 1,200. Well, that saves 200 lives. So I guess I'm for that. But of course, it doesn't solve the problem, and it's still thousands of people being killed. So yeah, to me, it's not a question of whether any body cam has ever done something positive. It's just not the answer.
Yeah, I mean, if it really were saving 200 lives a year, then we could really think about it as a harm reduction strategy and something that we might get excited about a little bit while we work on bigger issues. But the evidence just doesn't show that. I mean, the studies are really mixed. The best case scenario is that they achieve some very small reductions in police use of force that may or may not involve saving any lives at all. And we know the police have been using them to fake evidence against people, to plant drugs and then put it on the body camera and then use that in court. So it's there, for every supposed benefit, there are some very clear negative trade-offs.
And so let's talk for a minute about Cop City. And it's this multi-million-dollar project in Atlanta that also happens to knock down 100 acres of forest that's still some of the little remaining forest around Atlanta. And it's going to be used for basically training in urban warfare as well as Hollywood movies. I mean, it reads like a dystopian movie script or something.
Yeah, I was in Atlanta twice last year and have been in communication with folks down there as well. And it's been a remarkable campaign that's brought together both people concerned about police abuse and the environmental movement. It has become a kind of national rallying cry in this regard. And some, real concrete organizing has gone into building relationships with the surrounding communities. This is in an unincorporated part of the county but the municipality owns the underlying land. So the city said, well, we can just come in and develop it however we want without any oversight from the county, which means that the local surrounding residents had absolutely no input into the development of this plan on what was supposed to be state county parkland. They were going to turn this into a resource for the surrounding communities, and who are predominantly non-white. And now all of a sudden they're told, you're not getting a park, you're getting a police shooting range. And interestingly, this is part of a kind of movement in policing that was labeled a reform to move to what's called more scenario-based training rather than like textbook training or just shooting at a. And so the idea is here, you put officers in these mock villages and you arrange scenarios for them and you see how they react. But we've got new research that was just presented at the Harvard Kennedy School 2 weeks ago by someone who spent time going through this training and said, this training is actually making officers more violent, because what it does is it places some armed shooter behind every lamppost, around every corner. Every traffic stop is potentially deadly. And it becomes like the kind of killology training that has been reported on by the New York Times and others, where the police are basically trained to think that every interaction with the public could turn instantly deadly, and they better be prepared to shoot first, guilt-free, and realize that they are the heroic saviors and that they can't make any mistakes.
And a lot of people don't realize that the U.S. is fairly unique in this regard. I don't mean that other countries don't have police murders, but if you look across Europe, you have countries like Denmark and Switzerland where the average police murder numbers a year is 0 to 1. You have Iceland that's had 1 killing by a police officer in its modern history. You have, even the UK is, maybe in the teens each year, kind of maximum. So what is it about the US where you have cops killing thousands? And we should also mention that just recently, and I've been trying to repeat this fact as much as possible because no one seems to really talk about it, that yes, we had the most cop killings by cops in years this past year with over 1,200. However, the Lancet Medical Journal said it's actually over double that. They checked thoroughly throughout America and found that half of all murders by police are not written down as murders by police. So really, you're talking, 2,400 murders by police in a year.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, again, we don't know, in part because police just refuse to report the data, even though there's a federal requirement that they do so. And I would love to see, all federal funding of police halted until there's at the very least, full compliance with that requirement. So look, policing in Europe looks different because there's just such a radically different social context there. I mean, they have a social welfare state. They don't allow children to grow up in extreme poverty. They don't have mass homelessness. They don't have this long history of internal domestic colonialism and slavery that are so central to the history of the United States and our attitudes about race and violence and guns. And of course, we lionize in our popular culture everywhere we turn this idea that the way to solve problems is to mobilize violence. The revenge fantasies, the cop heroes, the military fantasies, and then we're like, oh, why are people shooting each other? Well, because every message they receive from our culture is that when someone does you wrong, you need revenge in the form of armed violence. Mm-hmm. So that is the environment in which policing exists here. It's both responding to a lot of violence in the society and as an institution is rooted in the use of extreme violence to manage the lives of folks on the losing end of political and economic arrangements. So the level of violence is not at all surprising to me. And one way to sort of undermine this lionization of violence and guns would be to downsize policing in as many ways as we possibly can and undermine these kind of cultural myths of people with guns as the solvers of all our problems.
Yeah, those are fair points.
And those myths don't exist in the same way in Europe. No one thinks that the major problems of European societies are going to be fixed by police officers. But yeah, that myth kind of persists here.
And I guess we can get into now I wanted to show your book up on the screen here. But I guess we can get into, a lot of people get stuck on like, well, what could possibly replace police? Yes, I might not agree with them murdering an unarmed person the way they do, but I want them there when someone breaks into my car, and I want them there when someone breaks into my house, and it's going to be just chaos if we had anything other than our current police system. So maybe we can talk for a bit about the options of what would replace much of policing.
Yeah. So, so part of the problem here, right, is that a lot of folks want to deal in abstractions, right? They imagine that the existence of policing means that when they have a crisis, somehow the police are going to come fix it for them.
Right.
But how many people have had their car broken into and then somehow the arrival of the police made the situation better?
Right. They actually solve, street crime. They solve it very rarely. And they're responsible for more theft than actual street crime.
I mean, so we have this tendency, because we watch too many cop shows on television, to think that, well, police come and solve problems. They get the bad guys. And of course, this has very little to do with the actual reality of policing, especially in the most high crime communities where police are not at all a reliable provider of public safety. Now, this is not to say that the existence of the police as an institution in the absence of anything else doesn't provide some broadly protective function. I mean, if there were no police tomorrow, I'm sure there would be negative consequences of that. But the point of this movement, whether it's defund the police, police abolition, reimagining public safety, whatever, is to create new mechanisms, new institutions, new methods of producing public safety that aren't single-mindedly focused on cops with guns. So it turns out that for most of the things that we've sent police to go and do, there are lots of other things we could do instead. Now, some people who want to play armchair philosopher again and deal in abstractions are like, but there must always be some residue of policing, and therefore everything you're saying is canceled. As if to imagine that what I'm saying is tomorrow there are no police, and then we sort of figure it out. And since the police one time prevented a burglary, therefore we can't change anything meaningfully about policing except give them some more money for training. So
yeah, the perfect being the enemy of the good.
Yeah, and that's the irony here, right? Is that the defenders of policing are the ones engaged in a kind of Pollyannish abstract reasoning that's really divorced from reality. And it's abolitionists who are saying, no, we live in high crime communities right now, and we have some decisions to make right now. So let's go back to Memphis for a second. So the folks I've been working with in Memphis, mostly around this coalition, Decarcerate Memphis, have been saying for years that traffic stops, pretextual and otherwise, place a huge burden on communities of color and don't do anything to improve public safety. They're either part of a traffic safety initiative, which the research shows these things don't work, or they're part of like a pointless war on drugs, to which no matter how many people the police arrest on drug charges makes absolutely no difference. Or some idea that, if they wage a campaign of terror in high violence neighborhoods, that this will stop the violence. And the folks on the ground have been saying, right now, we want something other than policing to manage traffic issues, like civil engineers, like unarmed agents who can take your insurance report if your car gets broken into or stolen. Why do armed police need to do that? Philadelphia is moving in this direction, replacing police with a civilian bureau that will fill out your reports for insurance purposes. Why on earth are we paying police to do this?
Right. Yeah. And if you were to step out of our kind of social engineering, out of the fact that we grew up in this and we just think that the way in which you grow up is the norm, if someone were to say to you, if we lived in a slightly different world and someone were to say to you, hey, I think, people are going over the speed limit on the highway, we should have someone give them a little ticket if they do that. Well, who should it be? Oh, I think guys with guns should run up on them and see what happens.
In the middle of the night, sometimes. Yeah. So
it's insanity.
You mentioned Europe, and they don't really do that much in Europe. They use speed cameras.
Yeah.
And they build better road systems so that they don't have so many traffic fatalities. So they have less policing and better public safety.
I want to pull up a chart of this is, and it's funny because this chart is used actually by pro-police people to talk about, at least I've seen it used this way, to talk about how little police do that is dealing with violent crime. And so their point is, people act like all police do is run up on people with guns, but look at all the other stuff they do. But I think this chart should be important for everyone saying we should get rid of policing, or a large extent of it. Because if you look, if the entire box is the entire amount of time they spend on these things, and each box is the size of the amount of time they spend. And so it's like unfounded radio calls is massive, investigate a premises, burglary alarms, derelict vehicles. Almost everything on this thing should not be done by guys with guns.
Yeah.
It's actually like a perfect chart to say, what if we only, and I get there's even arguments to not do this, but what if we only had them dealing with that tiny little box down in the corner that says homicide or something?
Right. And somehow, because, someone did a study one time, some economists, found that the police with, $20 billion prevented one homicide. And therefore, because of that, and this little tiny box there, we have to preserve the other 95% of what police do. And this is the argument they make all the time. This Matt Iglesia, when he reviewed my book, he's like, oh, there's a lot of really interesting points there, but one time the police prevented a homicide, therefore the whole idea is null and void.
Yeah,
and so it's just
one time they stopped a pedophile.
Yeah. And so other places are figuring this out. So in the UK, they have neighborhood wardens who are not police officers, who are not armed, who don't arrest anyone, who deal with like the whole top half here. So that if there's a complaint about, garbage in front of a business, if there's a burglar alarm going off, if a business is concerned about someone's well-being, a neighborhood warden can respond and engage in problem solving, and they work for the local council, and they're tied into resources and government services and local nonprofits, and they could just manage it through that. Interesting, West Hollywood out in LA County recently canceled its contract with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and put the money into creating a street ambassador program that's intended to function in a very similar way. They don't work for the police. They're not police. They work for city government, and they're out on the streets trying to solve problems, connect people with services, resolve disputes, help people in distress. And that contributes to a safer climate because you got more eyes and ears on the street, more visible sign that, that there are people here to help, it works. And then you can talk about even more concrete kind of interventions that go into the lower half of the box there. So we got all these cities creating these non-police mental health crisis units.
Yep.
We see here medical assistance, missing person, drugs, curfew, truants, we could, minor disturbances, we could start shifting all of that over to non-police crisis teams that have mental health training, medical training, conflict resolution training. So the STAR program in Denver has been running for a few years now, or a couple of years now. And not only is it diverting a huge amount of 911 calls away from police, the neighborhoods that it operates in are experiencing significant crime reductions because the people who were causing problems are now having their needs met. So a person having a mental health crisis, instead of being allowed to spin out of control and then steal stuff and throw something and push someone, now there's a team working with that person, not to criminalize them, but to stabilize them. And once we stabilize that person, then we eliminate a huge number of so-called, crime and quality of life concerns. So not only is it cheaper, not only does it come with less violence, it works better than policing. And between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And we just need to get the police out of that. And in the STAR program, those thousands of responses, they haven't requested police assistance a similar time. A similar program in Albuquerque that was just profiled in the New Yorker, 1% of calls they requested police in some way. Right? Not to come shoot someone, but just because they needed a report of some kind or they needed a little bit of help with someone. But the other 99% of cases, no police were needed. None of these outreach workers have been shot, killed, stabbed, just doesn't happen. This is a myth made up by police unions and police leaders to preserve police budgets.
Yeah. And even if you did, if they responded to, 10,000 calls and then, one of them gets, unfortunately killed or something, the people would use that as the argument to go, all right, well, it clearly doesn't work. Get rid of it. And it's like, well, people die in car crashes. Have we
sanitation workers get killed by hazardous materials? I mean, yeah.
The sanitation worker, apparently, garbage people it's the most dangerous job in America, apparently. One of the most dangerous. So
no one holds a parade, with 10,000 police officers when they die on the job.
Right. And then I also saw that in New York City, for example, the people that cycle, roughly 50% of the people that cycle in and out of prison, jail a lot, are homeless. So the police are kind of just wandering around, and a lot of what they do is find homeless people and find a reason to arrest them.
Yeah, and our lovely mayor, Eric Adams, former police officer here in New York, he said, he took a picture of himself saying, I'm here to roll up my sleeves and do something about the homelessness problem. Well, he was walking into a police station. That's his approach, right? The problem of homelessness, he didn't walk into the housing office. He didn't walk into the social services office. He didn't walk into the public health office. He walked into a police station to take that photo. So this is all part of this linkage between austerity and policing. Eric Adams, like most big city mayors, has absolutely no plan to do anything about homelessness, because this would require intervening in private housing markets, and they're funded by the real estate industry. Yeah, certainly in the case of Eric Adams and Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, and all these big city mayors. And so they have absolutely no intention to do anything to actually house people. So they need policing to help them manage the consequences of that profound public policy failure, because policing is what they use to suppress the problem from interfering with their reelection, efforts.
Yeah, and I remember, was it Utah? I think it was Utah. They actually essentially solved their housing issue. They eliminated 90%, not their housing issue, their homelessness issue. They eliminated 95% of homelessness by giving the homeless a place to live. They gave every one of them a studio apartment and a caseworker. And they eliminated 95% of homelessness. And then 5 years ago, homelessness went way back up in Utah because they got rid of the program.
Yeah, basically, Salt Lake City made huge progress using what's called a housing first model, as you described it, which is no transitional shelter, temporary, no, just put people in stable housing with support services. Interestingly, Houston and Jacksonville, Florida, have basically eliminated homelessness for veterans. They just made a political decision that, well, we're going to do something about this. And these are both in conservative states, and Jacksonville is a conservative city government. And they just said, no, we can do this. And they just did it. They intervened in property markets in ways that we were told was impossible. But once they just made a political decision, they were able to do it. And the same could be done in other cities. It's strictly a political issue.
What I'm wondering if there's any other cities you want to talk about, or places you want to talk about that have tried various things that have done well.
Let's talk about Newark, New Jersey for a second. So I was out there last year, where the mayor, who came out of the Black Power movement of the 1970s, and his father in the 1960s, and Ras Baraka, and he knew profoundly, right, that policing is not going to be the tool for liberating Black people. But he had to deal with the political realities, but he managed in 2020 to shift money out of the police budget and into the creation of a new agency called the Department of Violence Reduction and Trauma Recovery. And what they're doing is they're funneling money not into creating a new bureaucracy, but they're funneling the money directly to community-based organizations to do violence reduction work in the neighborhoods that have the most violence. So a lot of this is going into so-called credible messenger initiatives, which involves hiring people from the community that are known in the community, who themselves, when they were younger, may have been involved in violence or gangs, may have been incarcerated, to work with the younger generation to try to break the cycle of violence. To talk to kids, not wagging their finger at them, not like me coming into a school and saying gangs are bad, like that's not going to work. Mm-hmm. Like DARE and all these programs, they don't work because they're not credible. They don't speak to the actual difficult decisions that young people are trying to make. But these credible messenger programs, when properly funded and well run, they can get young people into trauma counseling. They can do neighborhood truces. They can help break up brewing trouble before it gets out of hand. Some of them are attached to hospitals so that if someone is the victim of violence, they're assigned a caseworker from their own neighborhood to try to stop the cycle of violence, the retributive violence that so often happens, not just from the person who was injured, but their family and friends who show up at the hospital and are like, who did this to you? We're going to go get them. The violence interrupter, the credible, is there to deal with the folks who show up to try to chill things out, to try to figure out how can we support this young person who's in this hospital bed rather than creating more violence. It's working. Yeah. The violence is going down. They're very happy with it. It could be a national model. It just requires the political will.
And talk a little more about race connected to policing, because I know a lot of people point to, oh, well, this, Tyree Nichols being an example, this was done by black cops. Therefore, it's not racism in policing. It's, something else. Or they point to they always seem to have a black higher up in the police force step out in front of the cameras in a lot of these cities and announce that they're looking into what went wrong and we're gonna figure this out.
I heard that that activists in Nigeria were like, if they would just hire more black police officers, that'll really fix the police abuse in Nigeria. That's really the problem. Except, of course, all the police are black in Nigeria. Right. And anyone working in a kind of one of these post-colonial contexts, India, Pakistan, whatever, this idea that the problem is a disconnect between the race of the officers and the race of people being policed, it's just ludicrous, right? And or same thing in Latin America, whatever. The problem is not the diversity of officers. The problem is the mission of policing. So policing in the US actually is not that different than the demographics of the country. About 12, 13% of Americans are black and about 8, 10% of police are black. A majority of the police in Memphis were black. Majority of police in most major American cities now are non-white. New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit, DC, Baltimore. They're all majority non-white police forces. And a lot of the leadership is non-white, including here in New York and Philadelphia and in Memphis. And this is not fixing the problem. It's not doing anything to change the basic function and functioning of policing. When politicians go around creating scorpion units, the police are going to kill people. And those scorpion units only operate in communities of color because powerful middle-class white communities would never tolerate being treated in that way. And so there's racism at work in all of this, but the solution cannot be achieved through a politics of representation of line police officers, much less police chiefs, who are following orders of political leaders who themselves may be black or Latino or whatever, but they continue to undercut basic social services and then paper over the problem with policing. And as long as they're turning to invasive and aggressive policing to solve their what are essentially political problems, not their crime problems, their political problems, then you're going to have abusive policing that should not be measured just in terms of how many people the police kill. There are 10 million police arrests every year, and the majority of them are totally pointless in terms of public safety. Totally pointless. And just one clear example is the war on drugs.
Yeah, which, great quote by former Nixon aide Ehrlichman, who in the 90s admitted that the war on drugs was created or at least, given booster rockets in order to go after Nixon's enemies, which were activist communities and black communities. And they succeeded in doing both. And of course, drugs should be a health issue, not a crime issue, which would change everything. Portugal has done the best example of that, where they decriminalized everything, and now they have the least number of overdoses and crime issues of just about any European country.
I was there this summer. It's great. I mean, do you occasionally see someone who's like subtly offering drugs for purchase? Yes, I saw that a couple of times. Was it a problem? No. There used to be real problems in Lisbon of open air drug use and aggressive competition for drug selling territory. There was violence, and all of that has basically been greatly diminished. And it has actually led to some neighborhood revitalization as well. So it's better for public health. It's better for public safety. And we need to take the logic that's gotten us moving on the legalization of marijuana and apply that across the board. Now, voters in Oregon a couple of years ago voted to decriminalize low-level amounts of all drugs. Implementation of that kind of got slowed down during COVID, so we're still waiting to see. And there's a lot of resistance from the more conservative rural parts of the state. But this is not politically impossible. Voters voted for this. They outvoted their legislatures, which is the same thing with marijuana. The vast majority of marijuana legalization procedures have been by referendum, because conservative legislatures won't vote for it, even though that's what people want.
Yeah, whenever something happens that people want that doesn't go along with corporate America, it's generally by some sort of referendum or ballot initiative and not through the actual Congress or state house.
Normal legislative process, that's right.
Which, by the way, our Congress has done nothing about police brutality and the horrible police system. I believe it's still Biden. I know it wasn't the first year. Biden's continues to give more money to police than even Trump did. So it's not really changing.
I mean, it's the good news is that this is really a local issue. The federal role is somewhat limited. They give some money away, which has not been good, has led to more problems, I think. And of course, they give away military technology and grants for purchasing Humvees and that sort of stuff. But Biden is fully committed to the kind of liberal narrative that says that there's nothing wrong with the law. We just need law enforcement to be more professional in its implementation of the war on drugs, for instance. Let's give narcotics units anti-bias training. That'll fix the injustices of the war on drugs. So it's just political pandering. He's always been close politically to police unions and law and order types. Yeah. And so there's nothing new here, right? He was an architect of the 94 crime bill that ushered in mass incarceration and more intensive police spending. So I never had any hopes of anything. I would just say the one good news is there have been small amounts of money that have gone towards some of these non-policing, like violence reduction strategies. But when you look at the fine print, even a lot of that money is actually going to police or DAs and others in the criminal legal system, and not really making its way to on the ground community-based organizations.
Well, and for a brief moment, there was a nationwide discussion or protest movement for quote unquote defund the police. And I remember, not that I see many of them, but Fox News was having a field day and saying, oh, well, look at these cities where they defunded police and now all of the crime that's everywhere. And there was essentially no defunding of police that went on. The only one that came close to doing something for a moment was New York City, but then they moved half of the money from other things back into the police. So they didn't actually defund much of the police. And so, Fox News run around saying, crime everywhere because they defunded the police.
Yeah. So, no police were defunded, really. This was just a talking point for the far right and really for moderate Democrats as well. So they, it's just politicized. So when the police, or when something good happens, like crime goes down, they're like, oh, see, the police work, we need more money for the police. And then when crime goes up, when police fail, they're like, oh, crime's up, we need more money for police, right? So whatever the facts are, it's always an argument for more money for police. So in this case, they just make the facts up, right? They just pretend that there was this defunding of police when a lot of places saw increases in police budgets, but policing doesn't work very well at what it claims to do. So we had these massive upticks in certain types of crime for certain periods of time in certain places. And that, of course, is just used for, yet again, every set of facts is just another argument for more money for police. The reality is that there has been the victories from the movement, which have been many, have been primarily in the building out of alternatives. I think the big exception would be school policing, where about 40 cities have gotten rid of their school police departments in some form and replaced them with counselors and after school programs and restorative justice. And that's going great. Those school districts are really happy. The parents are happy. The crime did not increase. There's nothing like that. And so interestingly, they never talk about that. The one case where there actually was some defunding of the police was schools, which has been fantastic. And then the other two areas where we've seen a lot of investments are these non-police crisis response teams and community-based violence reduction. And those things are working too. They're not generally directly relying on reducing police budgets, which I would argue is the next step, because they're just taking away huge areas of responsibility from police, and we need more resources to expand these initiatives, and it should come out of police budgets, over time through attrition as we build out these new infrastructures. And that's basically what the demand on the streets for the most part was in 2020, and it continues to be on the ground in places like Memphis, that where the folks on the ground are like, we don't need more police training, we need less policing and more alternatives.
What do you what's your response to the argument? I believe it was even made by Mayor Bloomberg as he was running for president, that yes, he put more police, a lot of police in black and brown neighborhoods of color, and his response was, well, unfortunately, that's where the crime is.
Well, interestingly, for almost every year that he was mayor, the police headcount dropped in New York City. The actual number of police went down and crime fell every one of those years. So Bloomberg's mayoralty is, in fact, more evidence that there's no direct linkage between police force rates, headcounts, and crime rates. Now, there are some studies around so-called hotspot policing, which stop and frisk can be related to, not necessarily, it's often used very indiscriminately, as was the case in New York, to say, well, stop and frisk might be helpful if it's carefully geographically targeted as part of an overall policing strategy.
Ignore whether it takes away people's rights, but yeah.
Well, that's the issue, right? So at that time, Kelly, the commissioner, Ray Kelly, was like, well, if we can save one person's life, then whatever we do is worth it. And I wrote a short little piece for the Daily News that said, well, that can't possibly be true, right? Because we live in a constitutional democracy, right? Yeah, maybe if we unleash death squads, that might save some lives. But if we
or how about getting rid of all alcohol? You'd think of the number of lives you'd save.
Right. But that's, at least, that we tried that didn't work, first of all. But second of all, what the police were doing was unconstitutional, and it took a while for the courts to be forced to kind of come to grips with this. But yeah, if we put a police officer in every bedroom, we could reduce the amount of domestic violence, but then we would be living in a police state.
Right.
And there are reasons why we don't want to live in a police state. And to hear like libertarians going around defending police budgets as part of some right-wing agenda just flies in the face of like their supposed concerns with issues of liberty and personal responsibility. So stop and frisk was a gross constitutional violation that undermined the well-being of these communities in measurable ways. We now have a large body of research that this produces bad health outcomes for people subjected to constant policing. It makes educational outcomes worse. It undermines employability, and it is a public health nightmare to do this to communities.
the vast majority of the arrests under stop and frisks were for, you know, tiny, it was like a joint in the pocket or something. It was, they almost never found like a firearm or.
No, and Kelly admitted that this is not about that. It's about a campaign of terror to terrorize young people into like not carrying weapons. And he understood that this was a campaign of terror. And it was unconstitutional. It both violated people's right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures, and it was a violation of the due process clause of the Constitution because it was so obviously racially discriminatory.
To go to training for a moment, what the way police are trained in America, maybe you could talk a little about what's wrong with it.
So, you know, I alluded to a little bit of this earlier. The problems are so huge, it's hard to know where to start.
Right.
But, so there's plenty of training out there that, you know, on paper seems like what you would want, right? They learn some stuff about the law. They learn some stuff about how to solve problems out on the street. They learn about limitations of the use of force, you know. But the old adage of the conversation between the new officer and his senior training partner, you know, out on the streets is, well, forget everything you learned in the academy. This is how we really do it.
Right.
I mean, that's the real problem more than anything else. It's not that the training is so terrible. I mean, whatever, they get less training, they have less educational attainment than their European counterparts, but they also just police in a completely different environment under a different set of political imperatives. So, you know, you've got the really terrible training. So, you know, the head of the Memphis police was going on these police training junkets to Israel, where they engage in widespread unconstitutional policing, you know, and
which is not that unusual. Israel's been used to train many of our police.
Yes. Well, especially since 9/11, lots of these junkets, they've fallen into disrepute since George Floyd making a little bit of a comeback. Jewish Voice for Peace has had a great campaign about these junkets and how harmful they are. But then you have all this like killology training that I mentioned before, which are these trainers. This was a reference to a specific guy, Grossman, who's like former military, who goes around telling police that they're the center of the universe, that they're heroes, and that comes with killing some people. And they better get their head around the idea that killing people is part of the job and it's what makes them heroes. And they better be ready to enact deadly violence on a moment's notice. And there's all this warrior mindset. You've got the police recruiting videos that are focused on SWAT teams and bashing down doors and armored vehicles and this kind of stuff. You know, all of that is obviously problematic, but I view most of it as a symptom of the problem, not a cause of the problem. You know, the cause is a political problem of turning every problem under the sun over to people with guns to solve.
Yeah, and the idea, I think a lot of people call police with the concept of just like they're kind of the daddy of society and they're gonna come fix the thing. And most of the time it's not something extreme. It's my neighbor's music won't turn down his music, or a fist fight or something. And of course, when they show up, you know, I'm making up percentages here, but there's a 50-50 chance that, you know, someone ends up arrested and stuck in jail for, you know, months or years. Their life gets fucked up in a myriad ways. You know, obviously there's a chance someone gets killed. The harms of it are so much larger than the positive outcome could be.
Yeah, there was an interesting new study released in the fall by the Vera Institute of Justice, which is, you know, a very mainstream research and program development think tank that works with police departments and prisons and jail systems. And they did a report on the costs of policing. And they said, look, we're going around talking about police effectiveness without ever measuring any of the costs other than perhaps the budget cost in a strictly financial term. And it turns out there's a lot of research on just how harmful policing is to those who are policed. And, you know, when people unleash policing thinking that it's going to help them be safer, they're not thinking about what they're actually unleashing. They have this television based view of, well, cops are the good guys who doing the best they can in a difficult environment to, you know, solve everyone's problems. And, you know, this is just incredibly naive.
Well, we're going to wrap up here in a minute. Is there any key area I've missed or failed to ask you about?
Well, there's always so much to talk about. Maybe I could just mention that I'm going to be speaking in Memphis on February. Let me just get the date here. On February 23rd, I'll be at Rhodes College with the folks at Decarcerate Memphis. And we're going to also be screening a film by Matthew Solomon called Reimagining Public Safety. And then I will be in Phoenix on March 16th, doing some stuff with local activists there. And so we'll have a public event. And so if you're in one of those places, keep your eyes open.
Can't thank you enough, Professor.
You're welcome. And I should say that the book is free for download right now. With the events in Memphis, Verso Books and I decided to once again make the ebook free to help support people in the movement. So get it now.
And if Ben, can you throw the Verso link into the comment thread as well?
Versobooks.com.
Yeah. So free download there, folks. If you can't grab the hard copy, then I hope you will definitely do that. Thank you so much for joining me and for tackling all these questions and for, you know, your continued efforts to educate people.
Thanks, Lee. I always enjoy our chats.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
All right, folks, there's the Verso Books link for you if you'd like to download the free copy. It's an excellent book and an easy read, and, you know, so important what Alex Vitale is talking about. Folks, we do these interviews twice a week. They're supported by you. I hope you will continue to support us at patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. I will be talking to Rania Kolick in a couple of days from Breakthrough News. That will also be at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Make sure you hit subscribe, hit the bell icon, and join me for more of this. And of course, the Most Censored News episodes. One of those comes out every week. And you can check out last week's, if you haven't already seen it, on how the U.S. is the true rogue nation. We are the rogue state. All right. I will see you soon. Keep fighting.